Good day. Welcome to the BizNews Edge. I'm Alec Hogg. It's the 13th of July, Monday, all day today. And on today's show, well, a wide-ranging conversation with John Endres. He's the chief executive of the Institute for Race Relations. We're going to talk to him about whether the growth message is finally landing in Pretoria, i.e. what it needs to get economic growth going in our country, why BEE remains the fault line that nobody in power wants to get rid of, and, well, a little more unexpectedly, why he's more bullish on South Africa, despite all our issues, than the UK. That's coming up. But first, let's have a look at the stories that are shaping today's agenda. First of all, on Friday, the government gazetted its draft policy on rebuilding South Africa's strategic petroleum stockpile. A tacit admission that we've had nothing worth speaking of since it was quietly sold off at the bottom of the market a decade ago. And that's exactly why I'd urge some pretty healthy skepticism before we cheer any of this along. Regular viewers to BizNews TV and readers of biznews.com will remember that in 2016, our investigation into what we called Oilgate showed how insiders had engineered the sale of what was then a 10 million barrel reserve that South Africa had, which had been built up during the apartheid era. And they sold it at the worst possible time at below the market price. So not only was their timing bad, but they actually got a discount on the worst price possible. And of course, we asked very valid questions on why it was sold at all, and indeed, who benefited from it. Our sources put the theft, and our sources were oil traders offshore, they put the theft at well over R1 billion. So before Pretoria hands a new state entity, the SANPC, the keys to rebuild the reserve, as they are stating they will do in the government gazette, taxpayers deserve answers on where the money went and cast iron guarantees that another Oilgate will not happen again. And staying with government, there's the migration story. And for once, this is a rare good news update from Pretoria. At a 2-and-a-bit-hour press conference yesterday, what is called the Interministerial Committee revealed that more than 53,000 foreign nationals have been repatriated. Most of those were Malawians who'd voluntarily decided to go home. The heavy lifting is happening at a new processing center in Messina, put together in days on state land. What struck me was that taxpayers haven't had to foot any of the bill for the feeding of those who are going home, most of them, as mentioned, voluntarily. MTN, Gift of the Givers, and a coalition of NGOs and faith groups have actually been picking up that tab. Proof, perhaps, that when government, civil society, and business pull together, things actually get done. We go to the Stock Exchange News Service for our third story today. Keep an eye on African media entertainment. A Sense report filed this morning said that a low-profile investment vehicle called Trucha Limited has quietly crossed the 10% ownership threshold, snapping up shares in the market, in the open market, to lift its stake from just under 8% previously. AME is a company that operates radio stations, so very much old school, old style. You might know Kaya FM, OFM in Bloemfontein, and Algoa FM in the Eastern Cape. Well, those are its crown jewels. It's cash flush, generates a lot of cash out of them, maybe declining, but it is still a cash generative operation for the moment, and it's controlled effectively by Caxton co-founder Terry Moolman, part of his empire. It's a classic illiquid small cap. barely a share changed hands today after the announcement that Pricier has got even more interested. Sitting on a very solid operating profit is AME, and having just paid out a chunky final dividend, it's appealing to patient capital. At current levels, I did an analysis on the intrinsic value, probably running by our standards at about a 15% discount. So you can see the appeal. Cash generative, good dividends, 15% discount to intrinsic value. And that's exactly what a company like Pricier saw in it. We haven't been able to find out who Pricier are, but I guess one of the members of the tribe will certainly be able to enlighten us on that in the not too distant future. Right, well, let's get into today's main event. John Endres runs the Institute for Race Relations, the longest and most prestigious think tank in South Africa. They tend to cross swords with governments, and I say governments because during the apartheid regime, they were not beloved at all by Pretoria, and that perspective has followed through to the ANC government and even the government of national unity. But that's what you want in a think tank, people who do the research and actually speak straight. John Endres certainly does that. His predecessor, Dr. Frans Cronje, is well known as well for his no-nonsense approach towards important issues for us. No spin, no political cover. That's what Endres is all about. He's your man. He's also going to be talking at the BizNews conference in August, and I'll have you know that we've just about reached our cap. So if you want to attend, it's time to get those tickets quickly. But we sat down, John and I, to talk about whether the growth message, or what creates economic growth for South Africa, is actually landing in Pretoria, that is. Why BEE remains so fiercely defended, even though everybody knows that it is not something that is helping the country. In fact, it's hurting us. If you've had 1% growth for the last 15 years and there's one constant, well, you got to look at that constant unless you are in deny mode. And also what it would take to bring our diaspora home. We've got so many skilled people who are sitting in capitals around the world, generating taxes and helping those economies to grow. And my goodness, they can make a much bigger difference here at home. Also, though, the most exciting part of this whole conversation is how South Africa stacks up, in John's opinion, to the UK. Got a huge diaspora there. I heard, still to be confirmed, that there are now more containers coming home from the UK than are going there, which is the first time in decades that's happened. And if you listen to what Endres has got to say about the future trajectories of both countries, you'll understand why. Has the elite consensus on BEE, you said there was a little crack there, has that widened? And I ask this because the events of the past couple of weeks tell us that those who are benefiting from it are certainly not going to give up without a fight. Paul Mashatile jets off to Dubai, picks up a contract of a very bad relative, or very poor relative to Starlink, a satellite option, an internet option, and imposes this on the country. Whereas Starlink is kept out, and the differential between the two, the one much more expensive and much slower than Starlink, is that it has 28% BEE or 25% BEE, whereas Starlink has none. So it almost appears that BEE is a huge thing, but when is the penny going to drop, either amongst those who seriously want economic growth in South Africa, or indeed those who are jobless and can join those dots?
I think currently there's certainly a strong defense going on of BEE. Often it's the recipients of its largesse that are the most vocal in supporting it. But at the same time, I do think that the defensiveness with which it is commented on reflects a weakening of the position of its proponents. And the issue now, I think, is to continue pushing, widening that breach, widening that gap, and continuing to point out that contrary to Mr. Ramaphosa's assertions, economic growth is in fact incompatible with the presence of these very extensive regulatory requirements around race in hiring and in procurement.
Oh, I hope you're right, but I think any South African in Britain right now, looking at South Africa House having to be dispensed of, would be saying, no, 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 thank you.
Yeah,
But
exactly. That's
all
the
of
wrong signal.
it, isn't it just the optics are just in the wrong place? But John, you've actually outlined very rationally, very logically, very unemotionally what the issues are. But this is not news. This is stuff that we've known in our country forever. Are you getting a sense that those who make the decisions are starting to consider the consequences of some pretty poor decisions in the past and maybe looking to something better in the future?
Maybe, Alec. I mean, that's the tough question. I do get the impression that a lot of our public campaigning on the question of raising the economic growth rate is beginning to show an effect. And we see um, calls or demands for economic growth to be prioritized, increasing in public debate. We think that is a very positive sign. We also notice, however, that the seriousness with which those calls are made is not equal across all political parties. And so I think it is more strongly embraced, for example, by the DA that recognizes the importance of getting economic growth up than by the ANC, which pays lip service to the notion, but I think is not really thinking hard about the tough decisions that need to be made for economic growth to rise. And so this remains part of our public communication strategy, is to explain why you need economic growth. It's the ultimate thing that needs to happen in South Africa for the country to come right, and to explain what you've got to do to get there. And that is, it does involve some hard calls, on BEE, for example, on property rights, on accountability for crime and corruption. That's not easy, but I think it is necessary. And I think that there's a growing awareness that just fixing infrastructure is not enough. More needs to happen. And we will keep pushing for that and hope that more and more political parties will embrace the urgent priority of economic growth.
Mm. It's such an interesting time that we're going through in South Africa on this basis. But one of the other areas that you've been looking at the IRR is, would we be able to get those million South Africans, mostly skilled, who've left the country back here? Now, you brought out a report and you can tell us about that, but I'd also love to hear your sense of the face-to-face conversations that you might have had with South Africans abroad, and whether we can hold out any hope that they are going to be reversing that trend, which I think the last numbers you gave us were 70% actually preferred to emigrate rather than only 30% coming back.
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're launching a diaspora survey where we'll ask diaspora South Africans about their reasons for leaving and maybe also the factors that would bring them back to South Africa. My sense from conversations is that the emotional ties that might bind people who have left the country to South Africa and persuade them to return weaken substantially over time. In other words, if you've left South Africa and you've been overseas for a year or two, and you get a job offer to come back, or you've still got friends, you've got networks in South Africa that make it easier to come back. But the longer you've been overseas, and if it's been 10 or 20 years, I think you might marry somebody from that country. You'll have raised your family over there. You'll have built networks of friends or business contacts, and you'll have less and less reason to want to return to South Africa. And I think that's going to be an important aspect for many people who left, many of them many years ago already. But there's another interesting aspect, which is that these decisions are trade-off decisions. And I think that South Africa, on its own merits, could convince South Africans to return if it plays its cards right. In other words, speaking to people in the UK, I think that that country is facing a great deal of difficulties at the moment. And South Africa, if it were to develop a sense of dynamism, optimism, forward momentum, which the UK currently is lacking, I think would be an attractive destination for expats. It would make South Africa an attractive destination for expats to return to. So the argument remains the same. Like we've got to fix our own situation, and then I think we will be able to persuade our fellow countrymen to return and bring their skills and capital, their know-how, and their international business networks to South Africa and help make this country more successful.
And just to sum up with John, when you came back from your adventures abroad, what did you bring back here from all of those conversations? What was the nutshell, if you could give us that?
Well, I found it really interesting looking at the UK because it seems to me that it is a country, a once proud and great nation, that has fallen on hard times, much by its own doing. And my sense here is that a big reason why that is happening is because the UK has lost its mojo. If you think of the Austin Powers movies, it's lacking the animal spirits to get itself right. It's become quite timid and shy about fixing its problems. And I think the underlying cause of that is that it has embraced the primacy of safety over freedom. In other words, the government promises Britain's people to keep them safe in many different ways. It does so by creating laws, by redistributing resources, by imposing restrictions. And I think that the British people have come to accept that. They've come to accept, online safety laws, speech restricting laws, laws regulating how businesses operate, the net zero approach to energy policy, for example. And as a result of this, Britain is getting poorer and poorer and weaker. And in a way, I think it is going to be harder for Great Britain to come right than South Africa. We face very severe problems, but I think that the animal spirits are in fine fettle in South Africa. The willingness and interest to get the country right is there, and we don't have to change as many things as the UK does to do that. So in a weird way, I'd say I'm more optimistic, more bullish on South Africa currently than I am on the UK. And it gives me no pleasure to say that from the perspective of the UK. I want that country to do well as well. But yeah, I think they really are stuck in a very, very deep hole, and it's going to be very hard for them to get out of that.
And the US?
The US is interesting because I think there we see that an extremely disruptive leader like Donald Trump is able to break through established ways of doing things and unleash some of the economic potential that becomes available when you create the freedom for it to operate. And that comes with its upsides and downsides, and it's very risky and very dangerous and doesn't always work out the way you want it to. But it does produce movement. And so if we look at the dynamism of the United States compared to the UK or the EU for that matter, it is just incredible. Now, if you look at the whole AI development, for example, to see the amount of resources marshaled, the amount of money being poured into that at breakneck speed without regard for the consequences almost, it's impossible for Europe to do that. It simply cannot do that. And the United States does this. It creates a lot of trouble. It's very dangerous. Who knows what will happen with AI, and who knows which companies will win, and who knows how much of this investment is misspent and misallocated. But yet they go ahead and do it because, competition is so strong. The freedom is sufficient for companies to do this. And I think they will reap the benefits. So if I were to play out, GDP growth of the US versus Europe and the UK, I think the US is just on track to outpace the UK and the EU by miles in the next few years. And it's very hard to see a way for Europe and the UK to come back from that.
So as a South African, you should be hoping that we can repair the relationship with the US, even though we might not like the guy who's running it at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we should find a kind of kinship with the United States, and we should identify this love of freedom and of innovation and of trying things and of being bold. We should identify ourselves with that sense, which the United States expresses so very clearly. And I think also another thing we have in common is being a multiracial society, in the sense that the United States is, in the modern parlance, very diverse, as is South Africa. And if you set the right institutional framework, the right conditions, the right policy mix, I think having that kind of diverse, multifaceted population is a huge asset to any nation. And South Africa does have that. I think ordinary people in South Africa rub along quite well with each other. That is broadly true of the United States as well. That is an asset we should use. And we must continue fighting against those who wish to divide us along group lines, racial lines, ethnic lines, and so on. I think a lot more can be gained by working together than by fighting against each other.
What a wonderful, uplifting way to end this discussion. John Endres is the Chief Executive of the Institute for Race Relations. He will be at BNC 9 in August, telling us his insights. We'll, by that stage, have a lot more, because he's one of those guys who just, keeps learning every day. And isn't that the best way to live? Well, that's your BizNews Edge for today. To recap, government wants to rebuild a strategic oil reserve after R1 billion of taxpayers' money was taken by somebody with the last reserve in 2016, a decade ago. Maybe they think we've forgotten about that. Not at BizNews, definitely not. I believe that Oilgate 2 would be just a matter of time if this goes unquestioned and unchallenged. But we do have a government of national unity, so perhaps those in the DA will now be asking the right questions of the ANC. But first of all, before anybody lets this go through, let's find out where that R1 billion went to. Name and shame. Also, 53,000 foreign nationals have been repatriated. Depending on what your view is on that, you'll either be cheering that or saying it's a problem because they are very productive people. But it is what it is. They were, however, efficiently processed. They've been fed by the private sector and NGOs, so no strain on the public purse. And then a quiet institutional buyer has just crossed the 10% threshold in Africa Media Entertainment. Old media company, but one that is full of cash and issues good dividends. So interesting to look at that one. And then from John Endres, a genuinely hopeful thought. Fix our own house here in South Africa and our people will come home and turbocharge this economy. It's on the cusp. So many good things that could be happening here. Let's hope that John's words are finally heeded where they need to be. Well, thank you for joining me today. For more on all of these stories, go along to biznews.com or BizNews TV. I'm Alec Hogg. Until the next time, which is tomorrow, cheerio. In uncertain times, good information is priceless. The BizNews conference is heading back to the Drakensberg. Join me, Alec Hogg, from the 11th to the 14th of August for BNC 9. Champagne Sports Resort, where it all began and where our community gathers for honest conversations, smart investing insights, and direct access to some of South Africa's sharpest minds. Come and rub shoulders with the best we've got. 28 keynote speakers, 3 days. Seats are available now. Book your seat by clicking the link in the description. Start your day a step ahead. BizNews Insider. It delivers the business stories that matter every morning straight to your inbox, sharp, fast, and free. Subscribe now.